Hi, I'm Josh and welcome to my June wrap-up. So this is coming up very late. It's been a very busy June and July. I'm here now, so let's talk about what I read. I read 18 books, which is a sizable increase from the 13 books of last month. So a good start. I mean, a much better month on average than last month. I had a very slow start in May and a much faster start thanks to the Queer Lit Readathon, which just went up, by the way, my vlog for that. Also very late, but I'm very excited about what I read because it was a really good reading month, actually. I really enjoyed a lot of what I read. Those that I didn't enjoy, I learned a lot from. So let's start. The first one I'm going to talk about is The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first of the Inheritance trilogy. It's just essentially a trilogy about this fantasy world. We have this woman who has been ostracized from her family, her royal family. Specifically, her mother was. Her mother left or was forced out because she chose to sleep with a commoner. And I think part of what it is that it's a very different skin color. So race is a thing here where she's distinctly different. She's considered less than because of her class and her race. And this is about this woman, this daughter of this woman, being called back after her mother dies to this royal family to compete in this sort of a fight for the crown, basically. What ensues is a fight between stuck-up royals and some pretty pissed off gods that are being controlled by these people in power. And I really liked this book. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I was really scared coming into this because I had a hard time with the 5th season when I first read it a couple of years ago, when I only read it a couple of years ago. I really like how the world was crafted here, and I really loved the creation of this sort of mythology, of this god mythology, and the inclusion in the narrative here. And I think it was just fantastic. Next book I read was Joplin's Ghost by Tanner Dew. This is a horror ghost historical fiction book by the acclaimed author Tanner Dew. She is known for writing a lot of horror, urban fantasy, and she also teaches a course on Afrofuturism and on Afro horror. She was the creator, or at least the co-creator, on the documentary on Shudder about black horror, which I still haven't watched. I really need to watch that. But I started reading her last year when I was trying to find more black authors who wrote horror, and I've just really enjoyed her writing, and it does not disappoint this time. I'm going to give you this 4 stars. This was, I think, half a star less than when I gave The Good House when I read it. And what I would say is similar about this is that the tone and the atmosphere created by Tanner Dew is entirely consistent. She knows how to write. She knows how to create the world and give you the feeling of a good horror story, or at least of a good creepy story. What I will say is that not all of this is that, though. This is essentially a split story about Scott Joplin, this acclaimed jazz musician, among other things. This is a real person, and this woman who gets his piano that he dies next to. And what we find is there's this connection between the piano and him, and when she comes in contact with it as a child, it ends up affecting her for the rest of her life. This woman is herself a musician in the modern day. This book came out in 2005, I think, so modern day is in quotation. But I thought it was a really good ghost story. It isn't necessarily scary, but it's always ominous and creepy. I do think it could have went in a different direction personally, but all in all, I still really enjoyed it. It was a solid book, and Tanner Dew did not disappoint. I will continue to read her books. Definitely read at least one more by her this year, if not more. Honestly, I'd like to read all of her books before it's all said and done. The next book is Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman and the Portrait of an American Hero by Kate Clifford Larson. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. First thing I should say is that when I made my June TBR, I said that these were all by black authors. It turns out this is not by a black author, but it is about a black narrative, so I still included it in my TBR. Because I've been wanting to read this for a while, among other biographies about Harriet Tubman, after I watched the movie they made about her. I liked this because it is really dense in facts. There's a lot of information here, and it really gives you context, all the context you need to understand the journey of her life. Now, the problem here, or a few problems, is one, there's not a lot of information about her life. So in trying to create this narrative, a lot of it is about giving context about the situations that she's in. Like thinking about the time period, the location she's at. The author spends a lot of time providing us evidence to help create the world that Harriet Tubman is in. And then once that is thoroughly created, she will give us what little information there is to give us further context about Harriet Tubman's role in that world. I think it works as telling the narrative of her life. Alternatively, though, I do think it sometimes comes across almost as if she is a side character in this overarching narrative, which almost just feels like a narrative of what it's like in this time, in this location. I still recommend it. I think it's really good. The other problem with it is that it is very academic, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just makes it harder to read. And that definitely knocked it down in conjunction with the fact that this isn't really a focused narrative on her. I think the main reason I took off on the rating was because of the fact that it was so academic, which doesn't make it a bad book. I mean, sure, I'm reading it to learn, but accessibility, I think, still matters. It's my preference. I have a few other autobiographies about her that I want to read. Okay, the next two books are going to be White Fragility and White Rage. White Fragility is by, I don't remember her name. White Rage is by Carol Anderson. Both of these books were read for the Blackout Buddy read. White Fragility is a book for white people by a white person. I've heard some pushback towards it for some legitimate reasons, obviously, and there is some question about what is said in the book and in the audiobook and what needs to be said, what the writer as a white woman has the right to say, which I think is of course entirely valid. Overall though, I really liked the book and what it had to say. I know for a lot of people, specifically black people, it's probably very obvious what's being said, but I think that for white people such as myself, I do think it said a lot of things that needed to be said, and if they weren't new, they definitely need to be reinforced. And in White Rage, I actually enjoyed more. But this is a very short yet concise outline of the history of white rage in America, and it even extends all the way up to Obama and into the Trump era, where we see these laws still perpetrating. And I particularly liked it as it got closer to now. Of course, I've learned about the past and I'm familiar with a lot of the things, although a lot of it was still new to me. But I guess it was a better appreciation for the racial divide, or the white rage specifically, that came into existence or was in existence in the 1980s, 1990s, and even the 2000s, 2010s. Because I grew up around it, it did feel normalized, a lot of the things in politics. And I do think for a long while, I didn't appreciate the foundation of where a lot of these laws came from, which is white rage. And I really liked it for that. It's a book that I would like to reread. It's also a book that I should probably look to for more references, because those kind of books always have a lot of good references. The next book I read was also 5 stars, and that is They Said This Would Be Fun by Eternity Martis, Race, Campus Life, and Growing Up. And I've talked about this in my mid-year freakout tag, and I really enjoyed this. This is a narrative of her memoir of her time at my university here in London, Ontario as a black woman. I thought it was fantastic. It is short yet well told, and she does an amazing job with the audiobook. It's just a really compelling narrative, especially as someone who attends the school. This, in conjunction with everything that's going on, has made me much more aware of the state of my university. I have always seen it as less problematic than where I came from, which is Georgia. That's just because it's less blatant around me. Part of that is lack of diversity here, but in reality, there is a serious level of racism, not to mention sexism, at my university. It really highlights the need for people like myself to stop being so complacent. I really like the book. I definitely recommend it to anyone who goes to Western University here in London, Ontario, and anyone else who I guess is interested in what it might be like to attend a college. I have a feeling that experience is going to be similar to what it's like to go to other universities. She talks about how Western compares to other universities in a lot of ways, but also how London, Ontario is unique to a lot of different places, specifically Toronto, because of the lack of diversity. And just a certain mindset and the history here in London really just highlights how different it is from Toronto. The next book is going to be a book a lot of people have already read, Dear Martin by Nick Stone. I gave this 4 stars out of 5, and I enjoyed this. It was a concise yet poignant novel that was really relevant to the times. So this is a story that is about a young boy who is writing to Martin Luther King, hence the name Dear Martin. And it is of course a hypothetical writing, but it is a way for him to sort of cope with everything that's going on in his life. It's a story of how a black boy could do everything right and follow the rules, go to a good school and everything like that, and still he is targeted as somehow being a criminal, or somehow being suspect, or being deserving of attack. And specifically, it relates to a series of events he has to undergo, and that makes him really angry and confused on how to cope with the reality he lives in. I thought it was a really good novel, specifically just in how everything it talked about. I'm pretty sure everybody but me has read this by now, but it was really good. I felt like the pacing was off. There's a lot of time spent on sort of just setting the stage, and then all of a sudden we got to the climax, which felt sort of sudden, but it was still a really good book. The next one, which I think I enjoyed more, still only 4 out of 5 stars, was The Hate U Give. This is a similar story about this young girl who who has worked really hard to be everything that is expected of her to avoid conflict. What we see is uncannily similar to everything that's played out thus far, so far as people getting angry and protesting, and it does an amazing job exploring why it's justified and why we shouldn't be angry about the protesting or the rioting or the looting. The problem is the system that should facilitate that. It's really good. I haven't watched the movie yet, but I do want to. Now I'm going to talk about books that I've already presented a video on, so I'm not going to go as in depth in these since I've talked about them in other videos. But let's start with the Queer Lit Readathon. The Hours by Michael Cunningham. It was made into a film with Meryl Streep and others. Is about these 3 different narratives, starting with Virginia Woolf as she approaches her death, then a woman in the 1950s who is reading her stories and trying to cope with her life. And then in the 1980s, when you have this queer woman trying to help her gay friend who is dying of AIDS. It was really good. I give it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is The Library of the Unwritten by A.J. Hackworth. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. This is about this library in hell, which contains all of the unwritten books. Books by people who haven't lived long enough to write them yet, or books that people died too early to write them. I thought it was really creative and really fun, but at the same time, it just wasn't for me. The first problem I had with it was that the tone wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't as realistic as I was expecting in this sort of demonic narrative. For more detail on that, you can just watch the vlog. But the other problem I had with it was the characterization. I just didn't really care about the characters, and I think part of the problem there was the fact that the narrative itself just felt like there was no weight. Like, because it was less realistic, it felt like there was no real threat to our characters. The next book gave 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's Ask the Passengers by A.S. King. It's about a girl who is struggling to figure out her sexuality. Is she gay? Is she straight? And it's really good. The one problem I had with this book was that it might have been one of our earliest novels because it was not as surreal or weird as I'm used to in A.S. King books. So it wasn't as good, in my opinion. Alien Echo by Mira Grant, aka Shauna McGuire, was a YA horror novel set in the Alien universe. I really liked this more so for the second half. The first half, it really leans into the teen angst YA section of it, but once it gets into the story, it really gets into the story. I thought it was really good. And now moving on to the Queer Blackathon. Queer Blackathon. The first book I read was Patsy by Nicole Janice Ben, and this is a story, a generational story about this Jamaican woman who leaves her daughter to come to America. And I thought it was a really fantastic exploration of what it was like to be an immigrant, but also what it was like to be a mother and then a daughter in this position, and both of who are queer and trying to explore that. But it was a really unique perspective that I had never heard about. It was really well written. The biggest problem I had with this was the ending, which I felt like everything leading up to it was perfect, but I feel like we should have spent a bit more time on that moment that we reached to really appreciate the impact of it. And I gave that 4 out of 5 stars. This one I gave 5 out of 5 stars because it's Roxane Gay, that it's Hunger. I absolutely loved this memoir. When it comes to eating and self-control, it's a problem that I definitely have. And then there were just the other parts that were just very personal to her and unique to her experience, but I so appreciate her sharing, and I love this so much. It might be my favorite one so far. It's hard to say. I've read Bad Feminist and not that bad, but I did absolutely love that one. Next up is Summer for the Gods by Edward J. Larson. The Scopes trial in America's continuing debate over science and religion. And this is essentially this narrative about everything that led up to the Scopes trial and what played out afterwards as a result of the Scopes trial. And if you don't know what the Scopes trial is, it's essentially the moment that a young earth creationist was faced with an evolutionary biologist, or at least a team of them, as the Bible was put on trial. Realistically, it was evolution that was put on trial, but what we saw here was the first public challenging of young earth creationism. And what I really liked about this was that it really challenges public perception, because part of what it talks about is how this shaped public perception moving forward. And at some point, yes, this trial was used largely to push the narrative of evolution, and rightfully so. When we first leave this, what really happens isn't any one victory. Technically, the creationist wins the argument, but a lot of people see the interactions that took place, the arguments that took place, as a social victory for the evolutionists. And both sides sort of took that and used it as a motivation factor for each side, where we see both sides getting more polarized, fighting harder for their cause. And for more on this, you can check my independent review, which should have gone up right before this, I think. I haven't actually recorded it yet, so we'll see. I read this because I got a NetGalley arc of it. It came out, I want to say, in mid-June. The arc was of a re-release of this book from the 1990s or 80s, and it was just an updated afterword. Not a lot has changed. All that he does is really add a bit of statistics and context to the current environment, and it is still extremely relevant to the conversation we have today. I feel like he creates a solid narrative of what is taking place to help ground the history as we go through it. And I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. You can see that review as well. There was one more story that I read, which is Bottled. This is another e-arc that I got from NetGalley, one of many that I have yet to review. So this is me reviewing it now. It is a horror novella about this guy whose grandfather has a house, which is weird, and I didn't like this. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. There was a lot about it that I could recognize, common ideas in horror. This idea of a haunted house and a house having a life, or a house being alive. And the problem I had with it really was I didn't think it was just developed very well. There were multiple times where I thought the story could have ended in a very impactful way, and it just kept going on and on and on. You would think a novella isn't too long, but damn, is it too long. Multiple times I saw what I thought would have been a good natural ending, but the author just kept extending it, and it really just forced the story to just keep going on unnecessarily. It was already kind of questionable in my opinion. I mean, sure, it's a creative idea, sort of like a demonic thing going on in the house, which sort of ties this family to it. It reminded me a lot of The Shining, in the sense that the hotel is alive, or perhaps a better comparison would be Writers for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. This is a similar story of the house being alive and sort of drawing the family back to the house, keeping them there, this sort of ominous idea. And I feel like in Writers for Witching, Helen Oyeyemi did it much more effectively. She explored this idea, this concept, much more effectively. So I highly recommend reading that book over Bottled. Those are all the books that I read in June. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great reading month in June. Let me know what you thought of the books that I read in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Stay safe.